What does the internet weather look like this week, Stan?
Well, we have pretty much similar activity as we normally see, so let me show you.
Okay.
So this is our top 10 most pro ports. We have all of the same ports that we generally cover. Port 23, TCP, Telnet, a bunch of web ports, 3389 RDP. So one of the things I've been taking a look at is port 445 TCP, which is related to SMB, the file sharing protocol, and other related services. So we'll take a look at that and see what that looks like this week.
Okay.
And the next thing that we like to look at is the same scanning activity against ports, but this time we organize the data by the number of sources probing. Again, this week there are no surprises. Everything that we see is something that we've seen before. There's not many fluctuations. So I'd like to revisit and look at port 8291 TCP, which is something that we looked at the last time I was here, and see what that looks like.
Okay.
So looking back 60 days on the number of devices scanning for this port, we could see some interesting trends. So near nothing in May, and then you see these spikes every so often, and some of them are bigger and some of them are taller. And this red arrow is approximately where we were the last time we talked about this port activity. You could see that, let's say during this peak, there were almost 7,000 devices per hour scanning for this port, all together in concert all of a sudden. So what you could see is something that started about 2 weeks ago is the sustained activity from all of the devices scanning kind of all of the time, instead of kind of coming in and out. It seems like the adversary who's operating the botnet on this port changed tactics now that there is sustained scanning from many devices continuously.
So what do we know about this port?
That's a good question. So I did a little bit of Googling around, and I found this older article, and it's related to a management port on MikroTik routers. So back then, there was a botnet widely reported, we talked about it as well, called Jaime.
Right, one of the bigger ones from what I remember.
Yes, and it was basically targeting this port because there was a vulnerability. And this is how the flow of the exploitation activity looked. I actually always like to look in the articles that have this level of detail because it helps me understand how do you detect this activity and how do you look for it. So I decided to take a look in our honeypot to see what do we see in the honeypot against this port, because if there's all this sustained scanning, then surely some of it will stumble on our honeypot, and maybe we'll get to see, is there a new exploit? Is it still related to that, or are there other things?
Research, right? To see.
Exactly.
Okay.
What kind of scanning activity is it? So one of the things I do is I try to say for a specific port, what is the distribution of different protocols that get detected on that port? So the honeypot is capable of determining what is what the other side is trying to do. Is it trying to do RDP, which looks like about 25% of the time? HTTP, which is what I would expect because this is like an alternate web port. There's even something called Foundation DB, which is a type of database, or other variants of HTTP or SSL. So looking at just the HTTP activity, the one thing that makes sense to look at is some of the URIs that are being requested by adversaries, and one of them exactly matches the URI pattern we saw earlier on the earlier slide, where from the description of the article. So this JS proxy URI, this is what an exploit attempt would try to
so that's probably from the MikroTik router.
It's potentially from a MikroTik router. So one of the things that I do in this case is I say, well, has this IP address done anything else against the honeypot? And when I explore it that way, I was able to see that it's just this one IP address in Asia. It's responsible for scanning, for every time against the honeypot for this. And he's actually hitting multiple different ports and hitting multiple different protocols, not just this. So it's likely they're just using like a scanning tool. Okay, so what now? So whenever you have a lot of coordinated scanning, it's always interesting to see where is that scanning coming from? So this is just a geographic representation of where the IP addresses are emanating from. And usually it lets you know, is there maybe a specific country that's more interesting for this vulnerability? Why? Because if it was like a vulnerable device or something like that, maybe it's only in a part of a certain region of the world. Maybe it's a router that's used by a specific ISP in a specific country. And what's interesting here is you do see hotspots in Southeast Asia, India, and Brazil, as well as Northern Africa there and a little bit in the Middle East as well. So just another way to look at the activity and try to understand it.
It's interesting to see that you can almost diagnose the advances in adversaries' use of a botnet, that this is probably the same vulnerability, the same target. It seems to be associated with a MikroTik router vulnerability that was found about a year and a half ago.
So we've been tracking activity on port 445 for some time. This is a view of 900 days of port 445 scanning activity. Probably remember this weekend right here, or mid 2017, WannaCry came out, big in the news, a big deal. The activity, if you could zoom in on that, you'd see the activity really significantly dropped and started creeping back up until it got to many thousands of devices being impacted. So the number of devices being impacted seemed to have been creeping down. So last time I was on the show, like in April, things seemed to be going well. Then the next time I was on the show, things seemed to plateau. Things started decreasing and decreasing again. So I wonder what you think is going to happen this week when I show you the next chart.
I think I was on the show last time you asked for a response in this, so I'm going to say it's going to continue to decrease.
That's right.
Yes.
You got it. And this is good news on both fronts. Number one, you're right. And number two, the activity is going down. You could see we're a long way from the old worm that used to impact this port. But there is a downward trend, and that's a positive thing.
Yeah, now, I mean, again, though, the sustained scanning is remarkable. I mean,
yes.
Because, I know we've talked about this in the past, but that initial level of scanning was from Conficker, right? The Conficker worm,
yes,
the remnant
exactly.
Scanning from Conficker. And now, if we got to that level of scanning, we would be, all of our top 10 lists would be changed. That the amount and volume of scanning in the network today,
yes.
compared to what it was, even a few years ago,
yes.
is just, it's remarkable. So,
I agree.
But yeah, I mean, hopefully this means that more patching is being done, more upgrades, more awareness, and eventually it will get to a much more manageable level. But yeah, progress, I guess.
Yes, one little itty bitty piece at a time, but it's encouraging nonetheless.
Absolutely. Thanks, Dan.
All right, and that's it for the internet weather this week.